The rise of declinism as an idea in contemporary politics sparked an interest in the history of ancient cultures and their eventual decay, often making comparisons between the American and the Roman Empire. Irrespective of whether these claims are valid or not, it is an expression of profound fear of societal decline, which can eventually result in a dark age. Today, we want to examine if these fears are legitimate or mere political exaggerations. The term Dark Age originated as a caricature of medieval Europe, popularized by Italian Renaissance intellectuals like Petrarch, who first coined the phrase in the 14th century. These scholars who idealized ancient Greco-Roman culture viewed the Middle Ages as a period of cultural decline. They disparaged Gothic architecture, considering it barbaric compared to classical styles, medieval Latin, seeing it as a corruption of the eloquent Latin of Cicero and Virgil, scholastic theology, dismissing it as dogmatic and abstract next to classical humanism, and feudalism, condemning it as oppressive in contrast to Roman republicanism or Athenian democracy. This negative perception of the medieval period was not limited to the Renaissance. Later Enlightenment figures, such as Voltaire or Gibbon, further reinforced the idea of the Middle Ages as an era of backwardness and decay. Without giving into the polemic of thinkers like Petrarch, Dark Ages generally can be characterized by periods of declining populations, gradual loss of literacy, and a primarily orally dominated culture in which a ruling minority monopolizes reading and writing and functioned as a mediator between the cultural artifacts and the common people. This is exemplified in the pre-Homeric period of ancient Greece or post-Roman period of Europe. The Enlightenment defined itself in direct opposition to the Middle Ages, where the Middle Ages are defined by an oral culture, restrictive access to education, vertical feudalist hierarchies legitimized by God, and the clergy functioning as mediator between the people and the contents of the Bible. The Enlightenment is defined by a writing-based culture, open access to education, horizontal hierarchies legitimized by merit, and individual intellectual activity. In his book Rules for the Human Zoo, Peter Sloterdijk describes Enlightenment humanism as a form of taming mechanism. A system of literary and philosophical education that cultivated humans through exposure to canonical texts, as exemplified by the 19th century Western societies. But this model has collapsed under the weight of mass media and digital communication, which shape a drastically different kind of human than the focus of Enlightenment culture on writing and individuality. Enlightenment replaced the inhibitory systems of the medieval period, such as prayer, ascetic practices, courtly etiquette, or Bible study, with new ones, thereby channeling human energies into culturally productive forms. Mass media, however, replaces these systems not with another inhibitory system, but with a permanent stimulus economy, where every impulse, anger, desire, or outrage is amplified and rewarded. Sloterdijk argues that media doesn't just represent reality, it reconfigures human psychology by flattening hierarchies of attention. A tweet, a sacred text, and a pornographic image compete on the same digital plane, erasing distinctions between high and low, profound and trivial. By rewarding immediacy, social media platforms thrive on raw, unfiltered reactions, bypassing the slower reflective filters of traditional education, and by eliminating delay. Where once a letter required days to arrive, now a message demands an instant reply. The disinhibitory trend is amplified by the rise of social media use and specifically short-form content that further decreases attention spans and enhances the already strong forces of distraction created by mass media. This disinhibition manifests itself culturally, neurologically, as well as institutionally, and is further exacerbated by cheap access to internet, phones, and entertainment. The semi-educated population, shaped by modern public educational systems, overwhelmingly consumes radio, television, and social media, rather than classical cultural works, literature, philosophy, and the arts, which demand reflection and active engagement to be truly understood. Unlike passive entertainment, these deeper forms of knowledge contain enduring wisdom, yet they remain neglected in favor of effortless distraction. Even those who still read often settle for diluted substitutes. Philosophy as recycled Stoic platitudes repackaged as self-help for men, or shallow formulaic romance novels for women. In our contemporary media discourse, Jordan Peterson represents the old Enlightenment inhibitory forces trying to tame the animalistic, disinhibited culture that mass media has created, which is best epitomized by people like Andrew Tate. Where Peterson preaches order and responsibility, Tate preaches egoism and domination, appealing to our more primitive nature, unencumbered by custom or ethical boundaries. People tend more and more toward the disinhibited Tate as opposed to Peterson because egoism is more persuasive than self-sacrificing responsibility in times of decline. Telling someone to clean their room while Rome is burning is not an effective slogan that will win over disaffected young men. In sport culture, disinhibition manifests itself in the rise of MMA. Prior to 2015, MMA has been a niche sport with some events going mainstream, but now it has established itself as a mainstream sport watched by millions of people all over the world, with MMA gyms gaining in popularity. The most popular combat sport before MMA was boxing, a sport with much more inhibitory rules. MMA is a sport with a very loose framework of rules, with fighters being allowed to choke their opponent unconscious or break their opponent's arm in order to win. It is clear that it is a much more primitive and barbaric sport, comparable to Roman gladiator fights, which were much more brutal than any form of athletic entertainment in ancient Greece. Cultural disinhibition can also be seen in the rise of anti-heroes in popular TV shows and movies. Pre-2000 Hollywood relied on clear-cut heroes and villains. Even anti-heroes like Travis Bickle or Michael Corleone were exceptions not characterizing the mainstream. From the late 90s onwards, TV and film began embracing protagonists who were complex and selfish, yet oddly likable. And as time moved on, they became cult classics epitomizing an entire generation. Institutionally, the decay of our Enlightenment writing-based culture can be observed in the decline of PISA test scores throughout the Western world, and deteriorating standards in prestigious universities, especially in the humanities, with many students reporting to have not completely read a book in their entire life. Linguistically, both the Anglicization and the rise of Zoomer language introduced foreign elements into non-English languages, without adding new meaning or functionality. Established words are often replaced not because the concepts they represent are absent from the native language, but because speakers, particularly younger generations, lack familiarity with them. Instead, they default to the language of mass media, the cultural space in which they were raised and formed their subcultures. This phenomenon is not exclusive to non-English languages. Even within the English language, Zoomer slang frequently displaces existing terms. If these were merely a one-sided influence, one might argue that Anglicization constitutes cultural imperialism. However, since the same trend reshapes Anglo culture itself, it becomes clear that this is a broader characteristic of Western cultural trends. Neurologically, disinhibition reveals itself through deteriorating attention spans and the proliferation of conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, and executive dysfunction. As Sloterdijk observed, we no longer inhabit study rooms where we engage deeply with a single text. We navigate a hyper-stimulating media space that compels us to leap from political elections to cooking tutorials, from blockbuster trailers to obscure historical documentaries, all within minutes. Another interesting phenomena is the cognitive offloading functions of search engines and the recent rise of large language models. The shift from search engines to AI represents a fundamental transformation in how we offload cognitive work. Search engines required active engagement. We had to formulate searches, evaluate sources, and combine information ourselves. This process, while outsourcing memory, still exercised our critical thinking. AI, by contrast, delivers pre-packaged answers, analysis, and even creative content, reducing our mental effort to merely approving or rejecting its outputs. The consequences extend beyond attention disorders. When meaningful, enjoyable work becomes neurologically disadvantaged, mass media culture contributes not only to cognitive impairments, but also to rising rates of depression, the logical endpoint of a system that privileges stimulation over fulfillment. A different manifestation of the presence of dark ages is the increasing reluctance toward having children. There are many different attempts at explaining this tendency, but they all converge on a materialist basis of interpreting the phenomena. In essence, they represent an argument that children go from useful labor in rural settings to expensive furniture in urban settings. On the surface, this seems plausible. The trend of declining fertility coincides with growing percentages of urban populations on a global scale. Yet this homo economicus interpretation of demographic shifts can't explain the existence of states in the West that resist such trends despite high degrees of urbanization and high development. States such as Israel signal that there must be something deeper at play that acts as a motivator to have children. Economic incentives may aid a cultural impetus, but it is a general social or religious conviction that acts as the core motivator. This can only be explained by a fundamental misinterpretation of what lies at the heart of human nature, and by the toolboxes of experts that rest on false epistemic foundations. It is possible to demonstrate under what economic conditions people don't have more children, but it is infinitely harder to demonstrate what the adequate social circumstances are under which people feel the need to procreate. One presents as choice, the other as obligation. This obligation is much more elusive and harder to determine. It can't be reduced to a simple question of purchasing power in urban settings and the view of the family as a purely economic arrangement. The degradation of child-rearing to a mere personal choice among many is a strong factor in explaining the decline in fertility, even if it is not acknowledged as such. It is precisely the materialist framing causing the issue, not explaining the issue, which then looks for more tangible reasons as explanation, such as the cost of raising children. Such thinking was completely alien to most human civilizations and still is in most parts of the world today. Most cultures act from the conviction that humans are social, even spiritual beings, not economic ones. And the cultures who have internalized this the most seem most robust at resisting the global decline in fertility. It is not an expression of economic inconvenience, but an expression of the decaying health of a culture and the lack of conviction that this culture is worth reproducing. Israel is an exception to this trend. It is part of the Western world, has a high GDP per capita, and sustains, relatively speaking, a very high birth rate for Western standards. There have to be other factors at play, other than rising prices in urban environments, and the only discernible difference between Israel and other countries of the West are strong religious commitments. It seems to not even matter much if the population lives under hostile conditions, something a Western person would intuit to be unfavorable to population growth. Even inside Israel's population is the degree of religiosity the most significant factor when it comes to birth rates, with secular Jewish people having the lowest fertility rate and more Orthodox Jewish people having the highest. Not only Israel acts as an example of this fact, but also the war-torn Afghanistan offers a similar perspective from the other side of the GDP per capita spectrum. One would have a hard time to find economic convenience as one of the main motivating forces among the population concerning the rearing of children. Arguably, it is even beneficial framing the lack of child-rearing as a question of economics, rather than cultural and spiritual decay. It paints the problem in a much more manageable light than it really is. An economic problem implies the possibility of adequate policy being able to remedy what's going wrong, but a broader cultural decay is not as easy to solve, and nothing is more alien to the Western world in this age than to admit we might live in worse times than we would like to admit. Now to a less criterion for the coming dark ages: the knowledge monopolization by the elites. As we already argued in our video on post-liberalism, we see a decline in the meritocratic selection mechanisms for elite positions, which give way to oligarchic elite selection mechanisms based on social relationships. But beside the ever-decreasing Ivy League admission rates, we can also observe the establishment of new para-institutional selection mechanisms that coexist with the already competitive university education system. Access to high-impact knowledge is mediated by connections, not merit. Academic funding and prestigious internships are often distributed through informal networks rather than open competition. And as the exclusivity of elite institutions and the para-institutional mechanism increase, the myth of meritocracy loses its legitimacy day by day. The already mentioned decline in literacy due to the omnipresence of overstimulating mass media is also handled differently across class borders. Silicon Valley's elites understand the dangers of modern mass media, and they have the resources to mitigate them. They enforce strict screen limits, prioritize analog hobbies, and send their children to low-tech schools, preserving their literacy and attention spans. Meanwhile, the general public remains exposed to the unregulated attention economy, where the algorithms addictively reshape young minds. By the time these protective strategies trickle down, a generation has already suffered irreversible psychological harm. Another recurring pattern of civilizational decline is the elite's tendency to reframe decay as moral progress. In Byzantium, the clergy spun the laws of concrete and aqueduct building as pious simplicity. Today, their ideological counterparts endorse deindustrialization and economic stagnation as degrowth. This is not adaptation but surrender. When elites no longer solve civilizational problems, only aestheticize them, they betray their role as stewards. Worse, they entrench their status by moralizing decline, ensuring their privilege outlasts the society they fail to defend. Our current social and political trends provide clear evidence of potential dark ages. However, this outcome is not inevitable. We can and should use our knowledge of historical civilizational decline patterns and not give in to fatalistic pessimism. Just as people behave differently in a study when they know they are being watched or not, so can societies behave differently and not succumb to the predetermined patterns of decline. As Arnold Toynbee observed, civilizations die from suicide, not by murder.